Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this session for Trisha's programming for Tisha B'Av. So our next session is going to be on suffering and metaphors, limits and opportunities with Dr. Tammy Jacobowitz. Dr. Jacobowitz is the chair of the Tanakh department at SAR High School in Riverdale, New York, as well as the founding director of Makom Basiach at SAR, which is an immersive adult education program for parents. She's also taught Bible for the Waxner Heritage Program and is an adjunct faculty member at Yeshiva Chovevei Torah. So we are going to begin this session in just a minute. It focuses on some of the different metaphors in the book of Eichah that serve to capture a range of different emotions in the wake of destruction. And the rabbis of the Midrash also draw on metaphor in order to grapple with the impact of that loss and a sense of drastic change, guilt, and anger. So over the next 75 minutes, we'll be immersing ourselves in these metaphors and considering the power as well as the failings of using metaphor to navigate sufferings.
All right, thank you all for coming on today to this class. It's a hard day to know how to fill and how to spend. And learning Torah, as we know, we're limited on how and where and in what way we can learn on Tisha B'Av. And I'm grateful that there's plenty of Torah that actually can help us through this day. And I have long found the Midrash on the book of Eichah Rabbah, to be a very useful resource to think about suffering, to think about strategies for suffering, and to, as we're now in kind of this 2:30 past Chatzot, we're not yet at redemption, but we're ready to start thinking about how to move beyond it. So I'm hopeful that this class will allow us to sit with and begin to think about what comes next. Before we get to the sources, I wanted to offer 2 words of introduction. The first is, a number of years ago, I'm a big fan of On Being by Krista Tippett, and I heard an interview with a therapist and author named Pauline Boss. And Pauline Boss introduced a term called ambiguous loss. The first thing she did was talk about how Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, when she introduced the 5 stages of grieving, she had never intended for them to be understood the way that many people understood them, which sounded as if it was 5 stages you go through and then there's closure. And Pauline's book is called The Myth of Closure, and she speaks about how even Kubler-Ross did not imagine that people would ever think that grieving ends, and that if you don't get to that end, you have somehow failed at grieving. And in the context of that conversation, she talked about this term called ambiguous loss, which is a kind of loss that many of us, to be honest, are experiencing right now. But before we talk about Corona, it's the kind of loss that can happen if, God forbid, your family member is missing in action, or if a family member is suffering from dementia, where you have both lost and not lost the person, where you are going through a process where in some capacity, let's say with dementia, the person, the body is still with us, and in other ways, the person is not with us. And she talks about how challenging it is to suffer through and manage the experience of ambiguous loss. I found that concept to be enormously helpful in thinking about not only episodes in my life, but also in thinking about what it means to be a part of Jewish history. And I'm just going to spoil the whole thesis of this class right now and say that one of the things I think Chazal did for us through Midrash, and specifically through the Midrashim we're going to do in the second half of this class, is they showed us a way of creating the possibility of ambiguous loss in a scenario that could have been understood as a closed book, that could have been understood as a grief that had an end, at a story that had an end. They create a petach, they created an opening so that we could exist in ambiguous loss. I'll get to that later in the class. Last week, I heard a revisiting of the podcast where Pauline Boss was back on the air with Krista Tippett, and she was asking her, I don't know if anybody else heard it, but there was almost a plea in her voice. Please, Pauline, you are the expert in ambiguous loss. We across the globe right now are going through this terrible time period where we are losing so many big things and so many little things, and yet we are still here and we're somehow managing. Give us some expert advice, like how can we do this better? And Pauline shared with Krista, she said, I mean, the truth is I'm going through it just with you. Like I'm not an expert on this, and let's check in periodically and see how this is going. And I heard in Krista's voice and in my own ears the kind of imagined fantasy that there could be somebody out there who would be able to say, like, here's the path, here's how you do this well. The reality is we don't have such a person. We're all in this together, and we're all trying to figure our way through this experience communally, personally, and globally. The second intro piece is to talk about language and metaphors, which is really the title and the main subject of today's class. I also think that thinking about the coronavirus and the pandemic that we're living through helps us understand why language, why metaphors are both so useful and so limiting when it comes to navigating suffering. I mean, how happy were we? How happy was the press when we could compare this at times to the Spanish flu of 1918? If there is something in our experience now that can be likened to something else, immediately there's a kind of comfort that emerges because you are not going through something, here's the other word, unprecedented, right? Every time I hear that word, I feel a shudder, a sense of don't keep reminding me that we have no analog. This came up for me so often in the early months when my kids would ask me questions about what was coming next and how things would go. And I had to admit to them that my knowledge was just as vast as theirs. And there was nothing in my life that I can compare this to, save 9/11, which was another kind of metaphor that helped us in some ways in America to say, we've been through something before that was all of us and we came together, etc., etc. So we see and we know that when we can find an analog, when we can find a metaphor to compare our suffering to, it automatically gives us a sense of comfort that we are not living through something that nobody has ever known, nobody can ever understand. Now, this appears to be the experience. We're going to get to Yirmiyahu just in a minute for those two psukim on your sheet. This appears to be the experience of the Navi, of Yirmiyahu, who spent so much of his career warning and teaching everybody to hear the thing they didn't want to hear, to see and visualize the thing they didn't want to visualize. And then, even when the Khurban came, he seems to be in a place of shock. The book of Eichah is filled with, as we all know, we've read it very recently, filled with so many painful psukim of a person who's expressing the inexpressible, trying to find a way, again, trying to find language, both as a way to help others understand what we've lost, right? That's the idea of a lament. And also it seems to find language in order to bring a kind of comfort. And Yirmiyahu is very personal in this book in certain ways, certainly the way that Chazal read Ani HaGever, the beginning of Perek Gimel, that's him. That's him finally allowing his personal voice to come through after a career of not being allowed to have a kind of personal life, the erasure of the self. If you think about the opening two prakim for a moment of Eichah, of which we have two representatives on the screen, they are both prakim that fundamentally borrow the metaphor of a grieving woman, a suffering woman, a woman who is compared to a bitula, who is compared to a zonah, who is compared to a woman who has lost her children. The full gamut, the full range, as it were, of a suffering woman's life cycle. She is the stand-in for Zion. Now, what's terribly difficult, I would say, about the metaphors in Perek Aleph and Perek Bet is that while they are just that, they are a metaphor to talk about Zion, Yerushalayim, and it seems at times also Am Yisrael, there are also images in these prakim that are real. The images of children asking for food, the images of mothers not knowing where to turn. Those also borrow, it seems, from the lived experience of Bnei Israel during that time. I think that's also a feature of language and metaphor in grief. It is an analog and it's also real. Now, Yirmiyahu in Perek Bet, if you look at the first pasuk there, towards the middle of Perek Bet, after he has been comparing Yerushalayim to that full range of female suffering, he says in pasuk Yud Gimel, Ma a'idech, ma adamelach habat Yerushalayim, ma ashvelach va'anachamech betulat bat Zion. Right? He says very clearly, in a note of exasperation, I've run out of metaphors, right? To what can I compare you to? Because what you are like right now is so unprecedented. But if I could, va'anachamech, the finding of language would offer a modicum of comfort. And then in a startling move, he says, Ki gadol kayam shivrech, mi yirpalach. Not my word unprecedented. He says, the reason why I'm having such a hard time finding the language to describe your experience is because your rupture is your sickness is so great. It's as great as the sea, mi yirpalach. Oh, it's beautiful. Even in the moment of expressing how there is no language available to him, he expresses that through a metaphor. Okay, there's much more to be said about Yirmiyahu and Eichah. We are going to spend the bulk of today focusing on what Chazal do with some of Yirmiyahu's choices, with some of his metaphors, and how they take them in all kinds of other directions. And we're going to start with the first one from the opening pasuk, probably the most famous. Eichah yashva badad ha'ir rabat yam, hayta ke'almana. How is it that the city who had once been so full with people is now sitting alone? She has become like a widow. Hayta ke'almana. If you look with me right at that opening Midrash, if you scroll down just a little bit, Michael, so we can see all of it together. Two different approaches, two different ways in to this mashal, two different ways of, as I suggested, offering a kind of coping. If we take this mashal, as Midrash will do in a moment, and take it very seriously and dig deep into it, maybe we can find something else in it that will give us a way out. So the Midrash begins as follows. Hayta almana ein ketiv kan, ela ke'almana. I should say, of course, that Eichah Rabbah was put together in about the 5th century CE. So we're talking about Chazal who are living in the land of Israel several hundred years after the second Churban Bayit, reading a book that is describing the Churban of the first Bayit. So we're hearing their words about those words, in a sense, getting 2 Churbanot for one. So they say Yirmiyahu did not use the word hayta almana, but rather ke almana, that ke, which of course is what you need for a simile. You need the ka in there. She is like an almana. Continues the Midrash. How is she like an almana and not actually an almana? Ki isha shahalach ba'ala limdinat hayam v'da'ato lachzor eleha. Remember this expression, it's going to come up later. This is like a woman whose husband went to Medinat Hayam, the provinces, extremely far away. But when he went on this long trip, he always had the intention, da'ato lachzor eleha, to come back. He didn't leave in a fit of rage. He didn't leave because he understood their marriage to have been over, he left for whatever reason. But during that whole time that he's gone, she is like an almana. So you see right away what the Midrash is doing. It's hyper literalizing the idea of a metaphor, or really a simile, and saying, okay, the fact that it's a simile already eases the pain. Let's take it really seriously and see that Yirmiyahu was not suggesting that Yerushalayim, Tzion, or Am Yisrael is actually an almana, but they're in this kind of limbo state and leaving open the possibility that at some point he might come back. Continues that passage, Darach kashto ke'oyev. Again, oyev ein ketiv kan, ela ke'oyev. When Yirmiyahu later in Perek Bet compares really God to an enemy, again, the Midrash says, let's be very careful. It's ke'oyev. Hashem is not actually the enemy. He was behaving as an enemy. Here it would be nice, the Midrash does not give us a way, there's no bracket to understand how can we soften it, what does that look like? But here it's a kind of a collection of other expressions in the Midrash which also have that kaf. Right away, the Midrash says, okay, there's a bit of softening that can happen. Davar acher. I'm moving quickly, but of course, if you have a question or a comment, please write it in the chat and I'll pause when I'm done with the section and take a look at what you have to say. Davar acher, another idea. Hayta ke'almana. Now we get two different opinions, Rabbi Chama bar Ukba and Rabbanan. First, Rabbi Chama bar Ukba. He says, Lema Yisrael domin. That idea of almana, you notice that all along I've been saying almana could be Tzion, could be Yerushalayim, could be Am Yisrael. Here, Rabbi Chama bar Ukba says, this is referring to Yisrael. Now, what are they compared to, he asks. Why almana? Why ke'almana? L'shomeret yabam shetav'a mizonoteha velo tav'a ketubata. Wow, okay. So she's compared to a woman, a shomeri yabam. Now, a shomeri yabam is a woman whose husband has died, and she is waiting to marry the brother of her deceased husband. She's in a limbo state. She is asking for her mizonot, meaning she is still being fed by the family, so she is connected to the family in that way. Velo tava ketubata, but she has not asked for a ketubah to say, this is over and I don't want to marry the brother and I'm moving on. She herself is creating the conditions by which she is ke'almana. Although not so fast, I'm sure you all realize, what do you mean? She really lost her husband. Right? So this is a very layered image because the Midrash is saying, yes, there has been a death. Yes, there has been a full loss, an almana. She is an almana. And at the same time, she's still hanging on by a thread. And she herself is the one, and of course, if we think about it, this is Am Yisrael. So the first opinion by Rabbi Chama bar Ukba is, we are ke'almana because of ourselves. We are still the woman, ki'ilu, who are saying, we want to be fed by this family. We want in. We're not taking our ketubah and saying we're done. That's Rabbi Chama bar Ukba. Rabbanan is going to answer the question of who's keeping her ke'almana in a very different way. V'Rabbanan amrei, mashal lemelech sheka'as al matrona, v'katav la gita, v'natan la v'chazar, v'chetafo mimena. Very painful to read out loud. Rabbanan says this can be compared to a king who got angry at his wife. He wrote her a get, he gave it to her, and then he took it back. Today we would call this a form of abuse. But he gives it to her, he says, here, we're over, it's done, and then he says, wait, I'm not sure, and he takes it back. Kol zman shehi mevakeshet lihinaseh la'acher, omer la, heichan gitech, shegerashtich. V'kol zman shehi tovat mezonoteh, hi omer la, kvar gerashtich. Anytime that this woman in this terrible scenario makes an effort to move on, to get married to another, he says to her, not so fast. Where's your get? I didn't divorce you. You can't go and marry somebody else. You're not free. And whenever she says that she wants to be nourished and fed, that she's still in the marriage, that he still owes her, that he's still obligated to her, he says to her, what do you mean? I already divorced you. This is a terrible Midrash. I'm happy I don't need to see your faces as we're reading it. It's a devastating Midrash because we know what's coming. It's devastating on its own as a mashal. It's perhaps even more devastating when you think about it in terms of the nimshal. That's arguable, where your pain resides. But here's the nimshal. We know who's who. We know who's the king, and we know who's that woman stuck in this very terrible predicament. Kach kol zman sheYisrael mevakshim la'avod avodah zarah, omer lahem HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Eizeh sefer kritot imchem asher shalachtiha. V'chol zman shehem mevakshim sheyaseh imahem nes, omer lahem kfar gerashti etchem, tichtiv shalachtiha ve'eten et sefer kritoteha eleha, from Yirmiyah. Many, many things to notice about this Midrash. The first thing to notice, of course, is that Am Yisrael is considered to be in that predicament of a woman who has both been divorced and not divorced. She is that woman who has no agency. She's fully constrained by, as it seems from the story, the categorical behavior, the unpredictable behavior of her husband. Of course, I glossed over ka'as al matrona, which in another shiur, we might actually amplify. Why did he get angry at her? What did she do? What were her sins? That's also an Eichah Rabbah. That's also a focus of Tisha B'Av, just not right now, right? What did she do? What did we do? We are not the innocent woman. We are not the innocent Am Yisrael. But from the vantage point of this Midrash, that's not the story. The story here is of Bnei Yisrael, who when they say, okay, we're moving on, the equivalent of marrying another, we're going to worship Avodah Zarah, which notice is not exactly an equivalent because it's a sin. We want to go and worship Avodah Zarah. Hashem says, what do you mean? Eizeh sefer kritot imchen asher shlachtiha. Now, if you have your Tanakh, you should look that up. That's in Yeshayahu. That's in a perek that is talking about the 10 tribes of Yisrael. They're like the first moment of eviction, of banishment, of get. And whenever Am Yisrael say, wait, 1 second, do for us a nace, stay with us, we want in, we want to be a part of this partnership, Hashem says, Kfar gerashti etchem. Now, if we take a step back from both together, both Rabbi Chamer bar Ukba and Rabbanan, we see two things. On the one hand, we see that this expression in Yirmiyahu, Hayta ke'almana, which served a certain purpose in his book. In the Midrashic reading, it serves a bit of a different purpose. Again, that term hyper-literalizing, taking that metaphor, that simile, and saying, let's really see what it offers us. And according to these two different opinions, they offer two perspectives on why it is that Bnei Yisrael are still in, arguably, a very difficult predicament with God, but in a relationship where there is both a tremendous loss, either Rabbi Chamer bar Ukba or Rabbanan, tremendous loss, either of the first husband or of a marriage that has any kind of stability, sanity, or love. There is tremendous loss, and at the same time, there is still a way in which the relationship is hanging on by a thread. Let me just pause there. I know that was a lot of material and kind of intense. Anybody want to share a thought or ask a question about anything that we've seen so far? Yeah. Which form is worse? What do you mean by worse? Worse in what sense? It's hard to answer.
Yeah, it's kind of open there. They're both qualitatively very and I guess I would say, like, which one is more of a painful image and a more painful metaphor?
Right. I think that neither of them are scenarios that anybody would ever sign up for or willingly be a part of, right, when they have distance from them. I guess the only bit of agency, which is a form of better, would be in Rabbi Chama bar Ukva, because she's choosing it. I find the Rabbanan to be more horrifying, and yet somewhat satisfying on a literary perspective, because there's such a beautiful way of weaving in the disparate stages of Jewish history and suggesting that it's all part of one story. Yeah, thank you. Great question. Rabbi Chama seems to point to a new God that we'll marry if one takes it literally. Right. The alternative that's never explored. Shomeret Yabam, who is God's brother? Great point. Great point. Okay, let's move on to the next part. I did promise you that there would be a redemptive turn in this year. If anybody's been paying attention, we're not there yet, and we won't be there in part 2. It's coming in part 3. Okay, Eichah Rabbah, as we just saw, that was Parsha Aleph. That was from the actual opening words, Hayta ka'almana. That's where the Midrash is behaving in the way that we are more familiar with Midrashim, going pasuk by pasuk. The beginning of Eichah Rabbah, if you study it, has 36 petichtaot. And a petichta, as many of us are familiar, a petichta is a particular literary form where Chazal bring a pasuk from another sefer, interpret that sefer, that pasuk, and eventually lead to the pasuk of the Mikra that is under investigation. This is a bit of an unusual petichta, unusual in a few senses. Number one, the opening pasuk is from Yirmiyahu, which is really doesn't qualify exactly as a separate sefer when we're studying Eichah, since it's the same author. And it's not far afield in content, as most petichtaot do, choosing psukim from usually wisdom literature that are woven back to the pasuk. The second is, as you'll notice as we move through the petichta, it doesn't seem to exactly interpret the pasuk in Yirmiyahu section by section. Some sections do, some sections don't. It has a life of its own. You'll see as we read along. Okay, the opening pasuk is from Yirmiyahu Tet. The pasuk is pasuk Yud Zayin. Ko amar Hashem tzvakot, hitbonanu ukir'u l'makonanot v'tavona. Interesting moment in this parak. The parak in Yirmiyahu is describing a lot of weeping, his own weeping, other people's weeping. And when he gets to this point, he's talking about the next stage of things, signaling to people that the weeping, the grieving will be so great that you will need to call in the professional lamenters, the makonanot, women in the ancient world who had this as a kind of job, where they would show up at a funeral, go through the streets and sing and lament and bring for other people an understanding of what loss had come. With Yirmiyahu, it doesn't seem to be that people will not understand, but that the grieving will be so many, you'll need to take out all the stops, the women and their daughters, the next generations. Could be that one of the questions that the Midrash is answering or addressing is why? Why do we need these professional mourners? Okay, 3 interpretations of perhaps the scenario that prompts this kind of lamenting. Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, Rabbanan. Rabbi Yochanan Amar, Lemelech shehayu lo shnei banim, ka'as al harishon, natal et hamakel, v'chavato v'higlahu. Amar, oy lazeh me'ezeh shalva nigla. So again, a king, and here it's not a wife. Speaking about metaphors, we know that we travel through many metaphors when we compare our relationship with God, all of which implicitly, if you spend time with teenagers and you use metaphors to talk about God, you will encounter the frustration and the infuriation. But it's not that. Comparing my relationship with God to a relationship with a friend, but I can see my friend. Comparing it to my parents, but I can get into a fight and then make up. That's true. That's one of the limitations of metaphors, never experienced as acutely in adolescence and when it comes to God. But here, this metaphor is of a king who has two children. He gets angry at the first one. He takes a stick, and with that stick, he hits him, and then he banishes him. The king says after the first son has left, oy vey, right? From what beauty, from what peace he has now been evicted or banished. It seems like this lament is for the son. He's lost the time in the palace. The story continues. Ka'asal hasheni v'natal tamakel v'chavato v'higlahu. It's very painful actually to read that, the way it's written, that it's the same behavior, the same action. It seems at first that the king does not learn from what happened. He repeats it when the same ka'as, again, left unsaid what the ka'as is about, not our focus today. But after that second son, who's only the second, doesn't seem to be presented as special or different or anything, but just the second in line, after he's banished, the king says, Ana hava de tarbute bisha, which is an astounding recognition. He says, I am the one, what does the translation say? I am the one who, the education I gave, the fault is mine, right? The education I gave him was bad. The king, in a startling move, right? Instead of looking at him and saying, oy lazeh, he says, anahu. He recognizes perhaps he has two sons. They both do the same thing, fall down the same path. He takes upon himself a remarkable amount of responsibility. And this isn't even the redemptive part. Kach galu aseret shvatim. V'idchil HaKadosh Baruch Hu omer lahem et hapasuk hazeh, oy lahem. See how well it fits. Ki nadadu mimenu, Hosea, talking about the 10 tribes. When they have been banished, Hashem says, oy lahem. Hosea says, ki nadadu. V'kevan shegalu Yehuda u'Binyamim, kavayachol, amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, oy li al shivri. Many things to notice again in this startling Midrash. We said number 1, number 2. Well, it's not so simple that they're just number 1, number 2. We find out that number 2 is Galut Yehuda and Binyamin. So when we, as the inheritors, right, the descendants of Yehuda and Binyamin, and of course that's the subject of Eichah, the first banishment, the first exile of Aseret HaShvatim has long happened. Okay, but then maybe you're not so special, you just were second in line, right? So that first passage already plays with your familiar sense of what does it mean that we're in relationship with God as part of the Shvatim. And number 2, within that very short span of time, at least the way it's recorded in that paragraph, the Midrash leaves open the possibility that Hashem actually, in addition to noticing our errant ways and our total failure at being a person who deserves to be in the palace, that's stage 1, also recognizes a tremendous amount of responsibility, and that oily, that cry, is not a cry for the other, it's a cry for the self. Of course, it's a cry for the self that is even worse than just a cry for the self, because it includes the suffering that he not only created by kicking them out, but it seems created from the very beginning as a parent. It only gets intense from there. That's Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish Amar. No, this can be compared, again, Lamelech Shahaya Lo Shnei Banim, but the scenario is not actually as Rabbi Yochanan had suggested. Ka'asal Harishon, same way. Natalata Makel, same. V'chavato, and he hit him. But in this case, upiper umeit. The son actually dies at the hand of the king, which shouldn't be so painful to say out loud, because we just read Eichah, and Yirmiyahu says it himself, right? Ke'oyev, we know where it comes from. We believe very firmly through the Nevi'im that history does not happen on its own, that Hashem is telling us through the Nevi'im that he is acting through history. But to say it just like that through a mashal, you see how a mashal is able to express the inexpressible in a way that you would never even dare to say it about the things themselves. The son dies. Hitchil mekonein alav. The father sits down, presumably, and begins to lament for the son. Ka'as al hasheni, v'natal tamakel, v'chavato, upirper umet. Amar, me'ata ein bi koach lekonen alahem, ela kir'u l'makonenot, v'tekonenu alehem. There's our pasuk from Yirmiyahu. So after the same thing happens with the second son, the father says, and I would imagine people have different interpretations why he says this, but he says, Ein bikoach, I have nothing in me anymore to lament for my son. I need to call people to do it for me. We could read that in a terribly callous way, we could. Or we could read it in a similar way to Rabbi Yochanan, not a full responsibility, but ein bi klum. I'm done, I'm wasted. As a parent, it's over. I realize now that I have nothing left to give. I don't even have the ability. Who am I to cry for this child? Kir'u l'makonenot u'tekonenu alehem. Kach, says the Nimshal, when the Aseret HaShvatim were exiled, Hashem was mitkonen alehem. And we have a pasuk from Amos. Shimu et hadavar hazeh asher anochi nosei alechem kina Beit Yisrael. And when Yehuda and Binyamin were exiled, again, there's that word kaviyachol, an important word that Chazal sometimes use when the metaphor seems to be perhaps too dangerous or too close up against where we don't want to go. The Midrash says, when Yehuda and Binyamin were exiled, God said, Me'ata ein bikoach lekonin alehem. And that's the moment when Yirmiyahu says, the end of that passage does a very nice kind of proofing that this makes sense as a read of the pasuk in Yirmiyahu. Why? When the pasuk said, call the women and they will come and they should come quickly and they will cry, the Midrash says, Alehem ein ketiv kan ela aleinu, didi vedidhon. V'tishena einehem dima ein ketiv kan ela einenu, didi vedidhon. V'afafeim yizlu mayim ein ketiv kan ela v'afafeinu, didi vedidhon. Meaning, the crying was not for them. The crying was for all of us. The crying is mine and the crying is theirs. And so when God, Kaviyachol, asks for them to cry for him, he's included in that crying. It's for him too. Finally, Rabbanan. And you see how things are intensifying. You should be scared to read the third. Rabbanan Amrin, Lamelech Shahayu Lo Shnei Masar Banim. That's not an arbitrary number. Now we're not divided by Ben Rishon, Ben Sheni. Now we're divided by the Shvatim. Umetu Shnayim Hitchil Mitchanem Ba'asara. When this king lost 2 of his 12, he found comfort in the 10. Metu Od Shnayim Hitchil Mitchanem Bishmona. Metu Od Shnayim Hitchil Mitchanem Bishisha. Metu Od Shnayim Hitchil Mitchanem Ba'arba'a. Metu Od Shnayim Hitchil Mitchanem Bishnayim. V'kevan shemetu kulam Hitchil Mikonen Alehem. Eichah Yashva Badad. Of course, there are echoes in here of Eov and the image of group after group after group, loss after loss. Rabbanan is so different. There's no ka'as. There is no banishment. There is no killing. There is just a king who is depicted as losing his children 1, 2 by 2 by 2 until he's left all alone. And in that startling final move, Kevan shemetu kulam hitchil mikonen alehem eicha yashva badad. What happens in that last line is not only in Rabbanan's image does the king still have in him koach likonen. Remember, this king got nechama all along. His job as a parent was somehow filled and emotionally resonant the whole way along. And at the end, he has bo koach, but his kina are the very words, Eicha Yashva Badad, which were the words of Yirmiyahu to describe the bidud of Yerushalayim, the bidud of Am Yisrael, and now Chazal give us a present, and they say, guess what? Hashem is alone too. Hashem is bibidud. And when he cries for us, he is in parallel. The aloneness that we feel is made parallel by the aloneness that he feels. It's the pain of bidud. I'm saying this now. I never used that word out loud when I taught this Midrash, but it's so current. The pain of bidud is that we're all in it, and we're all in it on our own. And so the feeling of parallel lives, it's helpful, but up to a point, right? Like, I don't really want to hear about your bidud because I'm doing it too. I can't really gain solace from your experience because I'm going through it too. But there is something to know that you're not in this alone. And so I think at this moment, what Chazal offer us at the end of this Midrash, this very difficult Midrash, which positions God both in the situation of father who is creating hurt, they also position Hashem as the one who is the only who knows what it's like to be like us. Eichah Yashvabatzad. Okay, I'm going to stop there again if anybody has any comments or questions before we move to the last part. Noah, what do you mean?
I would think that Chazal would have a more like pluralistic presentation. So I would think that like seeing how the Rabbanan understands God's the Rabbanan's understanding of the mashal, that there's more and more emotional depletion as each loss occurs, to the extent that he no longer has the koach to actually lament the current state of his final sons. That kind of would show us that Rabbi Shimon's mashal isn't a father who's like saying that he doesn't have koach anymore because he's depleted, but rather is like the less charitable read that we were offering about Rabbi Shimon, that like it's just kind of like I don't want to be bothered with this. Yeah,
I guess it's always a question how to understand passages in relationship to each other. Generally speaking, my instinct is to read this as an intensification, and then you would be right? And on the other hand, it's offset by the Eichah Yashvabatzad, where the king at the end emerges not as an even worse kind of killer, right? It's Meitu, and he is one who offers himself, who offers his kinah. So this Midrash is a little funky that way. And I guess you have a choice. Rabbanan helping you understand Rabbi Shimon, or the other way around. Adira, what do you mean?
Kind of like when you say like, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. Like, so when the second son is being, died, he's like, oh, maybe I have to take responsibility for what happened. It wasn't Rabbanan, I think it was like the first or second interpretation.
Yeah, so in the first one, the son has not died, he's been banished. So there's more room for him to say, right? He says the fault is mine. Right? So again, we don't know how old these children are imagined to be, but they seem fully grown. If a parent, that's a terrible realization to have, right? Everything I've given them has led them on this path. What do I do now? Right? What does it even mean at that point to take responsibility? What's interesting for us as readers of this story with the Nimshal is that we are that second son who's still in banishment, right? And we hopefully don't see ourselves as unredeemable. Try again. Give us another path. Give us another way home. We want to be in that palace, right? I'm happy you see that it's not all me. Maybe there's perhaps more possibility for a future with Rabbi Yochanan, clearly, than the others when the child's not here. Right, you see with the child hearing in your head, because the ones we're coming next are all going back to the marriage metaphor, how different things sit when we see ourselves as Hashem's children, or we see ourselves as Hashem's spouse. A very different room for where things could have gone wrong, what the expectations were in the relationship or are, and what do you do to redeem the process and the path. And the amazing thing, and we see it just today in the short shiur, we are not allowed to use one or the other. We are both. We are both. We occupy both positions, and Hashem, Hashem occupies at least these two positions with us. So how generative can these metaphors be, and limiting, in helping us to understand what it means to be in relationship, and what does it mean to be metakein, to fix the relationship? Where do I start? Do I start seeing myself as the kid or the spouse? What do I expect of Hashem? Okay, Michael, if you don't mind scrolling to part 3. Okay. No, why are you smiling? You know these midrashim?
No, I just have breathing space, so it's finally like less,
Okay,
less intense, maybe.
It's still Eichah Rab and it's still Tisha B'Av, so the breathing is still shallow. But here's what I was talking about in terms of ambiguous loss. Okay, the next 3 midrashim that we're going to look at, I really see as examples of how Chazal not only gave us the path to be where we are today, which is Jews learning Torah as a means to understand ourselves in relationship to Hashem and as connecting to each other as Am Yisrael. We are heirs to the work that Chazal did in midrashim like this. So these are like meta midrashim. But I also think that they go back to what I was talking about in the beginning of how did Chazal create breathing space within the metaphor? How did they create a way in which we could look at the losses right up close and yet find within those losses the possibility to stretch it so that it's like an MIA, so that it's ambiguous and it's not over. That's what I mean by metaphoric breathing space. Okay, take a look at the first one. Eichah Rabbah, Parsha Daled, focusing on a pasuk in the middle of the perek, Vayatzet Eish B'Tzion Vatochal Yesodoteha. You'll notice if you're following in the English that the English follows a slightly different version of the Midrash. It's a little bit longer, but essentially the same. The pasuk in Eichah, if I'm reading it at face value, right, there's not actually a metaphor in there. It's that a fire, he has kindled a fire, and we know who the he is, and the capitalization makes that totally clear, which has devoured the foundations. Vatochal yisodoteha. If I'm not reading it as a metaphor, which it really isn't in the pasuk, then the yisodot are most likely talking about, well, at a minimum level, I'll just pretend I hear your responses. Minimum level, Beit HaMikdash. More maximal level, Yerushalayim. Most maximal level, Am Yisrael. Vatochal yisodoteha. The most maximal level is unacceptable. That's what we've been saying. Ke almana, please. Don't write me off. This isn't over. If it's the yisodot, that's a very frightening idea. It's not just that there was actual banishment, fire. Remember the metaphor that partakes of reality, death, division, etc. But to say that down to the foundations would make it seem as if the whole thing is over. In order to temper that pasuk, or actually I see the tempering, so here's where they temper it. They bring a pasuk from Tehillim as an intersecting pasuk. And the pasuk in Tehillim is Mizor la'asaf, Elokim ba'u goyim benachalatecha. Opening to a perek which is describing destruction. And Chazal take a good look at the opening of that pasuk and says, Mizmor, a song, b'chiyami ba'ilei. Why did you start it with Mizmor? That's not appropriate. That's off. That's a mismatched intro. It should say, and if you look in the English, they gave lots of options. A weeping, a lament, a dirge, not Mizmor. To answer the question of why Tehillim begins with Mizmor, and to address the question of Yesodot, Rab Elazar offers the following mashal. Amar Rab Elazar, mashal lemelech she'asach chupa libno. Oh, we're back with the sun. Tikain bito giyada v'siyada v'tziyara. A king here, we didn't get to see this yet, in the loving stage of his relationship with his son, where he not only commissioned the chuppah for his son, for his upcoming marriage. We don't, by the way, know who the wife is, not part of the story. But he himself built it. Giyada, v'siyada, v'tsiyara, those rhyme. Those are the three verbs that describe just how much love and effort the king himself put into building this chuppah. Pamachat, hich iso u sitara. There's that ka'as again. It's like the leitmotif of today. One time, the son got him angry. Again, we don't know why. It's not the focus, but it's there. It's always part of the story. And the father tore down that chuppah that he himself had built for the son. Hitchil pedagogue Yoshev umezamer. The pedagogue, who is the hired tutor, the one who spent so much time with the prince, who taught him not just Greek and wisdom and possibly Torah, but also was responsible for his moral education. This pedagogue, watching this scene along with everyone else, sits down and starts to sing. Or in the other version, he takes out an instrument and starts to play. Amrulo, people passing by, said, Hamelech harav beito v'ata yoshev umezamer. Notice, by the way, the slippage already from the Nimshal. Since when is it a bayit, right? But he says, the king destroyed his house and you're sitting and you're singing, which you could add to that. I tried with the exclamation points, question marks, like either it's like chutzpah or it's what are you thinking? Or, right, it's exasperation and it's confusion. It's paradoxical behavior. And the pedagogue says to them, Lekach ani mezamer, sheshafach hamato al chupat beno, velo al beno. Two ways to read this. First, just literal. He says, I'll tell you why I'm singing. I'm singing because the king destroyed the chuppah. He let out his fury, literally, on the chuppah and not on his child. So there's good news and bad news here. The bad news is we find out the pedagogue knows that the king could have killed the son. We know that already from the other mishalim that we offered. The good news is that the pedagogue brings to the surface that nobody else had even thought of. He says, yeah, I see that destruction. I see that beautiful chuppah that was an expression of this love the king has for the child. But I'll tell you what I also see. I see the king going for a walk, I'm adding this in, with the child. The child is still alive, everybody. The child is well. Let's look at the loss. Let's acknowledge it, but let's not get swallowed by it. Let's look at what else is in view. And what else is in view, my friends, is the ben. Here's the Nimshal. Asaph says, right? God destroyed his mikdash. I'm sorry, they said to Asaph, Hashem destroyed his mikdash, and you're sitting and singing? And he says, yes, here's why I'm singing. Sheshafach hakadosh baruch hu chamato al eitzim va'avanim velo al Yisrael. The same story, right? What we thought of before, and even in the mashal as this gorgeous, painstakingly created chuppah, which was like the first structure where the couple would live. What we thought of in the psukim as the Beit HaMikdash, the glorious Beit HaMikdash, now in the eyes of Asaph, in the eyes of the pedagogue, he says, listen up, people. You know what that bayit was? It was eitzim va'avanim. Let's look at its materials. And materials can be rebuilt. They were destroyed. They were burned. But Yisrael is intact. So that opening pasuk, which we said bore the possibility of linking ourselves to a fate which was total and complete with closure on the grief and suffering, now is reread as Vayatet Eish B'Tzion Vatochal Rak Yisodoteha. That's it. It was just the Yisodot. It was just the building that was destroyed, but the relationship is intact. Okay, this is the kind of redemption that I'm talking about for Tisha B'Av. It's not a happy story, right? There's loss, there's destruction. It's terrible, it's public. Everybody sees it, everybody knows it. And yet, what the pedagogue offers, which of course is the stand-in for Chazal, let's look at things in another way. Let's not get swallowed by the loss in front of us. Let's look at those psukim again and see in those psukim the possibility for a story that will take us out of here. Oh, I'm seeing lots of comments. Let me take a break before I move on to the next one. Oh, that's terrible, Natalie, right? If he killed all his son's friends and was like, well, you're still alive, right? But that's not this story, right? You're right. If that's what it would, it's not a callousness about murder, if I'm understanding you correctly, right? It's a recognition that there is a rupture in the relationship. There's ka'as, right? And we could take sides there and say, well, maybe he's just an angry guy, or we could say, I don't know, we're looking at this time and time again, there's ka'as for good reason. So there's rupture, but within the rupture, there is also the possibility of a long-term view. The expression, the representative of their love is not the whole thing itself. That's what Chazal do. They expand our vision. The Beit HaMikdash is not the sum total of what it means to be in relationship with Hashem. It's a stage. But the story is much longer. Okay, I'm not reading because I was talking. That's right, Natalie. It wasn't a chuppah out of the metaphor. It's a lot of people, and that's what I was trying to say, that there is both metaphor and real, the destruction and the loss and the people. It is not being ignored. It's a part of the story here, but it's not the focus at the moment. Yes, Sophia, it is just like that. Yes. Joel, I do think it's minimizing the temple. I think it is. And I think that's, again, like if we think about it in a meta way, that was one of the gifts that Chazal gave us. To at once mourn and lament and give us ways of never moving on completely from the loss of the temple, but also giving us a way of being in relationship with each other and with Hashem through the Torah, with the temple not at the center. In the Nimshal, who is the pedagogue? Is it the rabbis themselves? Yes. And I think not just Talmud Torah, Gabe, but I think that it's Talmud Torah in the way that they're modeling it, right? A Talmud Torah that is reading with the redemptive eye. Okay, how are we doing on time? Where's anybody going? It's Tisha B'Av. Okay, 3:30. Okay, we're running out of time.
Yeah, we have about 15 minutes.
Okay, so can you scroll down, please? If I'm losing time, I need to go, or not losing time, but if I'm making a choice, I should choose the third over the second, because the second is, but wait, I haven't decided yet. Okay, we'll do the second quickly. We're not going to pause after the second, and we need to get to the third because the third is just a bit more redemptive than this one. Okay. You know this story. You've seen it in other capacities. You'll let me know in a minute where you know it from. Okay, the Midrash is on a pasuk in Perek Gimel, Ani HaGever, that I referenced in the beginning. That's the I voice. That's Yirmiyahu, according to Chazal, who is giving of himself and of his own story. But it's also kind of startling if you've been reading along, because Perek Aleph and Perek Bet do not have the I voice in terms of a male, right? The metaphor has been a woman. Every so often the Mishorer interrupts and speaks directly, so to speak, to the audience. But the question that Chazal implicitly are asking is, Mihu HaGever hazeh? Like, who is this? Ani HaGever. Who are you? What does it mean? Okay. In the interest of time, I'm skipping the first line, which is a kind of a paraphrase, and go to the Mashal. Mashal Melech sheka'as al matrona. Now we're back in the marriage relationship. There's anger again. There's a king who gets angry at his wife. Udechafa. He pushes her out, v'hotzi'ah chutz lapalatin. Halcha v'tzimtzama paneha achar ha'amud. He kicks her out of the palace, and she goes and she constricts herself, tzimtzum, right? She makes herself small next to the pillar, but she doesn't actually leave the palace. Nimtza ha'melech over v'ro'eh ota. And when he presumably stumbles out of the palace and right away sees her, he says, Akashi tapayich, right? Which is like, you're chutzpahdik. You're acting with brazenness, presumably, because she hasn't left. Amra lo, Adoni hamelech, kach yafeli, v'kach na'eh, V'kach ra'ui li, shelo kibla otcha isha acheret ela ani. It's amazing, right? We don't know what the fight was about. We've never known. We don't know what the kas was about. We've never known. At this moment, when he says to her, you're being brazen because you're still here, she says, no. Kach yafeli. I'm totally in the right. It's totally appropriate for me to be right here. Because if you remember back at the beginning of things, nobody else would have you except for me. Right now, we could say a lot here about what happens when couples fight. Very often the fight or the disagreement or the rupture is the same. It just looks different over time. In this case, it's being told in a very extreme way. Whatever they're fighting about is that, right? So she says, don't forget what happened in the beginning. And he says, what do you mean? Ani hu shepasalti kol hanashim ba'avureich. No, I didn't want to go out with any of those other girls. I only wanted to go out with you. Amra lo. Im kain, lama nichnasta lemavui ploni ulachatzer ploni ulamakom ploni lo bishvil isha plonit v'lo kibla otcha. She says, really? That's how you remember things? Then why were you going down that street and into that courtyard or in an updated sense on that website and that app? Wasn't it for that woman and that woman and that woman, and she wouldn't have you? End of conversation, right? Now, there's so much to say about this, but we want to get to the end. Spousal arguments. We're looking at it from up here. We don't know the truth as the readers. The only indication we get, which Chazal give us, is the way they craft the story, is that it ends with her comment. She gets the last word. He doesn't retort. Now we know who he and she are. It's us and Hashem. You know the story, right? This is the story of Hashem offering the Torah to all the other nations. But in the versions that you normally know it, it's a story that either denigrates the Gentiles or makes the Jews look like, we don't ask any questions, we're great. But in this version, I'm skimming, when Hashem says to Yisrael, akashitun apechon, which is the version of you're still here hanging on to the pillar, we say to God, yeah, you better believe it that we're still here because nobody else would have you. He says, what do you mean? We say, yeah, that's what happened. You offer the Torah to everybody and nobody would have it. And we said to you, Kol asher diber Hashem na'aseh v'nishma. So our ability to be here right now. Now, how does this fit with what we're talking about? How does this relate to ambiguous loss? We're back in a situation in this Midrash where there is a rupture. Nobody wants to be in that position, either of the banisher or the banishee. Nobody wants to be in a marriage where you're finding a way to negotiate that you should stay in the, no, right? This is terrible. And yet, what Chazal are saying to us is there's a way that we can have agency and we can say to Hashem, we're not going anywhere. We want in. We want to be here. I know it looks like it's over. I know you feel like it's over. It's not. We're finding a way back. Okay, let me make it more clear to you in the last one, and then we'll pause for comments. Okay. Here's the Tisha B'Av redemption. Zot ashiv elibi al kain ochil. Also Perek Gimel. It's that moment in Perek Gimel where the Mishorer has just described his total absence of hope, his inability to even remember what that felt like. And then he says this pasuk, this I recall to my mind, therefore I have hope. And what follows is Chasdei Hashem ki lo tamnu. Hashem is great. What happened? What's the Zot? What are you recalling to your mind? And then suddenly you're able to find a new way of being, a new way of thinking, a new way of breathing. Here's the mashal. A king who married a woman, and he wrote for her a tremendous ketubah, meaning not the regularized one, but he wrote in the ketubah, in the event of the dissolution of our marriage, I will give you this number of dwellings and this amount of jewelry and this amount of kesef v'zahav. A rabbinic love poem, right? He doesn't give her the gifts, he writes about them in a legal kind of way, but he's expressing to her at the outset of our wedding, I love you so much, I want to take care of you, no matter what happens, I'm putting aside all these things for you. And then he went away for many, many years to the provinces. Remember, we saw that. This is the almana. This is the king who puts his wife in a position where she's like an almana, but not because of. What word is missing from this mashal? Ka'as. There's no ka'as. This is another way of understanding what's happened. There's not ka'as. There's I don't want to fill in a word, abandonment that only feels like abandonment but isn't really. And what happens while he's gone? The shchenot would make fun of her and they would say to her, Lo ba'alech shavak yatech? Zili nisbilach gvar uchranan. Like, lady, what are you doing? He's not coming back. It's been so many years. Go and marry someone else. And she would cry and she would sigh. And then she would go into her original chuppah and she would read the ketubah and she would sigh again. But this sighing at the end of the reading was not like the first sighing. Not all cries are the same. We know that. The crying, the sighing at the end was the sigh that allowed her to wipe her tears from her face, go out of that chuppah and face another day, another month, another year, until probably the cycle started again and she went right back in. Many years later, the king comes back and he says to her, I can't believe it. How'd you do it? I don't understand, right? Maybe not what we would have wanted him to say. There's no explanation, but he says, how did you do it? And she says to him, my master, my king, Ilulei ketubatcha miruba shekatavtali, kavar hitu oti shechinotai. Were it not for that gorgeous ketubah that you wrote for me, that you had the foresight to write for me, I wouldn't still be here. It's an incredible move because instead of saying to him at that moment, you know what, I'm just really patient and I'm really resourceful. That's why I'm here. She turns it into an opportunity to bring him back into the relationship and to say, I know that you didn't plan this. You didn't plan to abandon me, but you showed me how much love you have for me in that writing of the ketubah. And every time I went into my chuppah and I read the ketubah, yes, I had to do some imaginative work to recover that love, but it was there because you planted it. We survived this together. We survived the bidud that we had together. And now that we're back, we can repair and we can return. The reason why I find this mashal to be so helpful is because when Chazal wrote this and when we're reading it, we're still in that time zone before the Biat HaMelech, before the Chazara. Lachar Yamim V'Shanim, they're confident it will happen. Hopefully we're confident it will happen, but it hasn't happened yet. We're living in that in-between time. We're living in that time when you could, as the neighbors did, as the Nimshal, the Christians did, they said, it's over. Move on, join the new covenant, right? We could have read it that way, but Chazal say, let's not do that. Let's not read it that way. Let's look at the treasures that we have. Let's look at the gifts that Hashem has given us and find in them reason to stick around. Again, is this what we would have dreamed of? Is this what we dream of for our kids? No, but it's the reality. It's the loss with the possibility of hope. That's the ambiguous loss that Chazal created for us that has allowed us over these years to live with so much suffering and with so much beautiful connection and culture and growth, both spiritually, intellectually, and physically. That's also Tisha B'Av. That's also what metaphor can do for you. It gives you breathing space. It allows you to really explore all the sides of the condition, and hopefully it also provides some comfort. Thank you all for learning with me today. If anybody has any final comments or questions, please, you can just unmute yourself or just write it in the chat. Thank you, Adina. So nice to learn with you again.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jacobowitz, and thank you so much to everyone for being here. I just wanted to quickly note our last session for the day, which will be beginning at 4 o'clock. We have 2 parallel sessions. We have God Who Suffers With Divine Presence Amidst Pain with Rabbi Dr. Julia Watts-Belser. We also have a session geared toward young women in high school, the Poetics of Destruction, a text study and interactive workshop with Shira Hecht-Kohler. So we hope to see you back for that. a meaningful and easy rest of the fast for everyone.